1910, or D, 1890? All right, question number 2. For at least how many years have sea otters been an important part of the culture of indigenous peoples along Oregon's coast? Is it A, 200 years, B, 1,000 years, C, 5,000 years, or D, 10,000 years? All right, question number 3. Sea otters were hunted nearly to extinction by A, Russian fur hunters, B, British fur hunters, C, Spanish fur hunters, or D, all of the above? All right, question number 4. What's the most abundant type of canopy forming seaweed off of Oregon coast? Is it A, bull kelp, B, sugar kelp, C, feather boa kelp, or D, giant kelp? All right, question number 5. This adorable sea otter is related closest to which of these? A, sea lions, B, wolverines, C, raccoons, or D, seals? All right, question number 6. What factors are contributing to urchin barrens along Oregon's kelp forest ecosystems? Is it A, lack of sea otters, B, collapse of sunflower sea star populations, C, quote, zombie urchins, or D, all of the above? Question number 7. Is this statement true or false? The sea otter is the largest member of the weasel family, yet the smallest marine mammal in North America. The sea otter is the largest member of the weasel family, yet the smallest marine mammal in North America. True or false? Question number 8. What percentage of body weight does a sea otter need to consume every day on average? Is it A, 40%, B, 15%, C, 25%, or D, 50%? All right, question number 9. The total number of sea otters released in Oregon in 1970 and 1971 was A, 13, B, 41, C, 92, or D, 117? And our last question, number 10. The Elakha Alliance wants to reintroduce sea otters to Oregon in order to A, create a more robust and resilient marine ecosystem, B, rekindle the cultural connections between Oregon coastal tribes and sea otters. C, boost economic benefits of coastal communities. Or D, all of the above. All right, we're going to go through those answers, see how much you already know about sea otters. If you're with someone and you want to swap papers to grade, go for it. If you want to grade your own, that's fine. OMSI believes the honor system. But let's go through those answers. Question 1 was asking when the last wild sea otter in Oregon was killed. The correct answer there is C, 1910. 1 is C. Number 2 was asking about how many years sea otters have been an important part of the indigenous peoples of our coast. And the correct answer there is at least D, 10,000 years. So number 2 is D. Number 3 was asking about sea otters were hunted to extinction by whom? Might be sadly obvious, but the correct answer there is D, all of the above. Russian, British, and Spanish fur hunters. So 3 was D. Number 4 was asking about the most abundant type of canopy-forming seaweed off of our coast. The correct answer there is A, bull kelp. See a few people excited they got that one right. Good job. So 4 was A. Number 5, sea otters are related closest to which of these? It is B, wolverines. Like wolverines, sea otters are of the weasel family. So 5 was B. Number 6 was asking about what factors are contributing to these urchin barrens along the coast. And the correct answer there is D, all of the above. We'll learn more about those zombie urchins later, I think. So number 6 was D. Number 7, true or false, the sea otter is the largest member of the weasel family, yet the smallest marine mammal in North America. That is true. That is true. 7 was true or A. Number 8, what percentage of body weight does a sea otter need to consume every day on average? The correct answer there is C, 25% of their body weight. So 8 was C. Number 9, total number of sea otters that was released in Oregon in the early 70s there. That correct answer is C, 92 sea otters. So 9 was C. And then finally, the Elakha Alliance wants to reintroduce sea otters to Oregon in order to all of these. Yeah. Chanel is always very excited to talk about otters. Before we go to grading, I just want to plug there is a table in the back if you hadn't already seen it. Chanel from the Elakha Alliance is here with lots of swag and info on the way out. But go ahead and total up the correct number of responses. Give it back to the person that took it if you swapped pages. And by a show of hands, did anybody get all 10 correct tonight? We got any perfect scores? Chanel, you don't count. How about 9s? We get any 9s? Oh, we got a few 9s. Very nice. How about 8s? Oh, we got a lot of 8s and 9s. All right. So if you got 8 or 9 on the way out, show that at the OMSI table and you'll get a free ticket to the museum. Congratulations. A little clap, clap. You know some things about otters already, and let's learn some more. So tonight we have Bob Bailey. Bob is the president of the Elakha Alliance's board of directors. Bob has spent nearly 40 years in coastal and ocean planning and management for the state of Oregon. He also served as a city commissioner for the city of Oregon City, a member of the City of Salem Budget Committee, and chair of the Oregon Wave Energy Trust. Let's welcome Bob.
Get myself situated here. So how do I advance this thing on the computer? Just the arrow, pardon me? The arrows, okay. All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming out tonight. This is great. You may have had a free evening and just needed to get the hell out of the house, or you may actually be interested in sea otters. So I'm happy to be here tonight to try to fill your quest for knowledge about sea otters. And this is a particularly interesting little portion of the entire effort that we've been involved with now for the last almost 6 years, or a little over 6 years. So this is going to take a while, and there's many parts to this story, but I have found it utterly fascinating to track down the various pieces of information that help inform this story. And interestingly enough, I was actually living in that region down on the southern coast near Bandon when all of this was taking place in the early 70s, but I had no idea that it was going on. And so here we are 50 years later that I actually went back to learn about it and try to put together a coherent story of what happened. So on the morning of June 18th, 1970, the Cape Blanco airfield, and if you've ever been down in that neck of the woods, it's a fabulous wild part of the country. A C-130 cargo plane came down from the clouds. And inside that cargo plane were 31 special passengers. They were sea otters from Amchitka Island in Alaska. So why were these animals being flown to the Oregon coast? The Oregon coast was once home to sea otters, and especially around these rocky shores along the southern Oregon coast south of Coos Bay. But no wild otters had been on the Oregon coast since about 1910 or 1911, as we just heard in the trivia question. These sea otters had fallen victim throughout their range to the maritime fur trade that began in 1742, when Russian explorers with Vitus Bering discovered that the native Aleuts and other indigenous people in that northern part of the world were keeping themselves warm with sea otter furs. And they brought some back. Those were quickly traded to China for high prices. And Russian fur companies began hunting those animals throughout their range near the Kamchatka Peninsula, northern Japan, and then proceeding westward across the Aleutian Islands. Even though there were not many sea otters, nearly as many sea otters on the Oregon coast, we think, as there were in other parts of their range, Oregon itself was not immune to this pressure, that by 1910, 1911, the last ones were gone. You saw this image earlier. This is from a newspaper in Coos Bay recounting in 1910 that Mr. George Forty, whose family still lives in Port Orford, brought up a nice sea otter pelt to be evaluated by this experienced sea otter hunter who estimated its value as $500 in 1910, which translates into a lot of money in today's terms. So they remain missing in Oregon and Northern California and have not lived here since then. We do occasionally get, and many of you know this, that we do occasionally get one or two wild sea otters drifting down from the population off the Olympic coast in Washington. Chanel hot-footed it out to Ecola Point earlier this summer to take this wonderful photo of one of two sea otters that were spotted around Ecola Point. They were there for a couple of weeks, so that was pretty cool. So some sea otters did in fact survive this awful maritime fur trade at about 7 or 8 major sites around the Pacific Rim, including around Amchitka Island, which, as you can see from this map, is sort of in the middle of nowhere. But Amchitka had a number of animals survive, and by the 1960s, these animals had rebounded to about 3,600 animals estimated around Amchitka Island. So those animals rebounded and became the nucleus of our story today. But Amchitka Island also features into this for another reason. Late in World War II, Amchitka Island became strategic territory for the United States as Japan had begun to occupy the extreme western islands of the Aleutians, preparing for an advancement toward Alaska and eventually the North American mainland. And so the US military built a number of military bases and air bases out on these islands, including Amchitka. And if you can just imagine living on Amchitka during the winter, they had 15,000 soldiers stationed out there in the cold, foggy, snowy winters on Amchitka, preparing to defend the islands and likewise, perhaps even launch a counterattack against the Japanese. So after the war, the troops, of course, left, the aircraft left, but the infrastructure of these large airfields, housing, water systems, and all of that remained in place. So during the Cold War, when nuclear testing became very controversial in the state of Nevada and the American mainland during the, first the Eisenhower administration, then into the Nixon administration, those tests were moved to Amchitka Island because of that infrastructure. That infrastructure allowed the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission to conduct a series of tests, beginning with, in 1965, a test. It wasn't really so much to test the weapon as it was to test whether the island would blow up. That one in 1965, one in 69 was even larger. And then one was planned for 1971, named Canakin, that would be exponentially bigger than the others. And this was the precipitating threat removes the not to other. So there was quite an uproar in a lot of reasons around the Canakin test, but one of them was potential harm to sea otters. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game and the U.S. Became the Fish and Wildlife Service, then called the U.S. Bureau of Sport, Fisheries, and Wildlife. They had already had some experience moving animals to places that they felt needed repopulation. So U.S. Atomic Energy Commission agreed to provide money, the funding, the support, and logistics to capture and transfer animals from Amchitka Island to a number of places, including the Olympic Coast in Washington, British Columbia, Southeast Alaska, and Oregon. Amchitka also factors into this in an interesting way too, because a young graduate student who was on Amchitka at the time to help count sea otters and begin work on his PhD, soon discovered a very crucial thing about sea otters and the role they play in marine ecosystems. His observations, published in 1974, are the foundational findings that still inform all of sea otter conservation today. And you can find more about this in a very interesting film that PBS, I think, did a couple years ago called Serengeti Rules. And you'll find this man, Jim Estes, there. So what he found was when he went diving to look for sea otters on Amchitka Island, he found a rich ecosystem with kelp, fishes, all kinds of invertebrates. But when he went to a neighboring island of Shemya, about 200 miles away, there were no sea otters and there was basically no ecosystem. It was dominated by nothing but sea urchins. And he said it was like this crystal clear message to him. He said that he knew instantly what he had seen about the role of sea otters in, I would say, directing the function or enabling the function of a diverse ecosystem and what happened when they're absent. So let's jump to the 1970 translocation. The Oregon State Game Commission worked with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game and decided that the animals that would come to Oregon should go to the southern Oregon coast, since that had the best, in their opinion, rocky habitat and had been the location of these animals historically. So as you might imagine then, there ensued on Amchitka Island a rather interesting effort to capture sea otters. And if you think about capturing sea otters in the water, that would not be an easy task, and indeed it wasn't. But over time, the biologists had figured out by copying what natives had done to use these tangle nets. They strung them out in areas where sea otters were found, and the sea otters would entangle themselves in the nets. But the biologists had to monitor them carefully because otherwise the sea otters would drown because they needed to be able to come to the surface. So the animals were captured after they tangled in the nets and very carefully removed. And if you're trying to deal with a 80 or 100-pound, very angry and upset sea otters with sharp teeth, this was not an easy task. The captured sea otters were held in these large tanks that had been built some years before for previous translocations and for research. These tanks had circulating seawater fresh out of the ocean, so to keep the animals cool and in their natural environment. So when the sufficient number of animals had been rounded up, they were taken out and placed into these cages, individual carrying cages that had metal bottoms. By then, the biologists had figured out that one of the barriers to translocating sea otters was if you take them out of the cold water with their dense fur, they overheat. So the trick was to keep them cool and to help them keep clean with their fur. So they built these special pens with this galvanized metal on the bottom that could be loaded with cold water and ice periodically, and then with the cage part on top. So each animal had its own carrying cage. So meanwhile, down in Port Orford on the southern Oregon coast, just south of Cape Blanco, and let me have a show of hands. Who's been to Port Orford? I know some people here have. All right, well, if you haven't been down there yet, you need to go. So at Port Orford, preparations were made. So you had the staff from the Oregon State Game Commission copying a technique used in Alaska, which was to build a floating net pen. So these big blocks, long blocks of styrofoam were encased in wood and then joined together to form a big square, about 20 by 20 or so on each side, with netting all around above and then with nets hanging down below. So animals would have access to the water but couldn't escape. So the Coast Guard, this buoy tender from Astoria came down to lift the net pens, the two net pens and the very heavy anchors into the water. So the Coast Guard had to be mobilized in this too. So where they were located was in the water in the harbor near Port Orford in a little situation called Nellie's Cove. And these yellow dots tell you approximately where those were located. It was a good place to do it because in the summertime, the winds come out of the north and Nellie's Cove is very sheltered. So these pens would be in a sheltered area. The wintertime, it's a different story. That place gets hammered on that side of the cliff. So on July 17th, 1970, these 31 otters were loaded into this aircraft and began a nonstop flight from Amchitka to the airfield just north of Port Orford at Cape Blanco. I talked to thanks to some folks who are here tonight, I happened to talk to a man who was actually in the co-pilot's seat on that flight. And he said it was a long flight, 9 hours with squealing sea otters in the back. So they did arrive in the early morning of the 18th of July in 1970. And these animals with 21 females and 10 males, each in its own cage, came down from the clouds to the airport. So the Oregon Department of Fish and Game had organized these trucks to go out and get them. The animals were offloaded and in their cages, put onto the truck and then trucked down to the harbor area and back down onto the beach to be loaded into little boats to be taken around the corner and loaded into these net pens. They were fed a diet of squid and fish fillets. And the report from a guy who was there is that they vastly preferred the fish fillets. So the sea otters, they were intended to be in the net pens for about 4 or 5 days while they recovered from their trip, cleaned their fur, and otherwise got acclimated. 2 otters died during this time. They really didn't survive the trip, so there were a total of 29 otters ready to go. And on July 20th, it was decided that they were ready. So a couple of local fishing boat captains were contracted to tow the pens from their location to their destination down a little bit further south toward Humbug Mountain to be released. So by the time they got going, the north wind had picked up. And once they got out of the shelter of Nellie's Cove and the cliffs behind it, the ocean turned, as they say in the business, gnarly. And so the boats were tossing and turning, the net pens were flopping around out there. And pretty quickly started to defabricate. The sides of the pen started to come down. The sea otters inside were relatively freaked out and had a tough time keeping up. So the decision was made to stop the tow and just release them right there. And somehow we're not advancing here. All right, a workaround. So as of later that afternoon, 29 sea otters were swimming in the ocean near Port Orford. So I want to save what happened that year to those 29 until after we do the next year's. So in June of 1971, a similar process happened, except that this time the plane landed at the North Bend Airport, about 40 miles to the north, because some of the animals were offloaded to be taken out to Cape Arago, and then the plane would go on down to Cape Blanco Airport with the remaining animals. So at North Bend on June 24th, animals were offloaded again in the same manner as before and loaded into trucks to be taken out to Charleston, where they were offloaded from the truck and put into fishing boats. The fishing boat, by the time the fishing boat left the harbor, though, to head into the ocean, the weather turned bad. A summer storm had blown in, and by the time they got out beyond the jetties, it was really, really rough. So they decided to go ahead and just release the animals in the ocean. Meanwhile, down in Port Orford, a similar drama was playing out in that the plane landed. Again, the animals were taken by truck down to the Port Orford harbor, but the same summer storm was battering Nellie's Cove, and they couldn't even get the boats out to the net pens. So they just decided to release them right there in the harbor, which is probably not the worst thing in the world, but it wasn't necessarily the plan. 2 animals died, however, in the process because their cages that they were in got knocked overboard and they could not escape. So 2 animals drowned, unfortunately, which left in Port Orford a total of 22 animals. Altogether, then, that meant that there were 92 sea otters that had been released between July of 1970 and June of 1971. So the big question is, where did they go and why? So I want to talk a little bit about the geography of the region, because this is one of the things that really has stood out to me as I've looked at this thing. And I'm not sure how familiar you are with that stretch of the Oregon coast, but they occupied a fairly large region. You can see there on the map at the north, they were found between the Coos Bay estuary on the north and all the way down to Cape Sebastian south of the Rogue River, which is a distance of about 80 miles. And these are some of the principal places geographic places where they were observed. Cape Arago Simpson Reef is out to the north, is a complex of coves and offshore rocks that provides terrific habitat, especially around Simpson Reef, with its fringing reef right near the very tip of Cape Arago. Gull Rock, a little bit further south, down just on the north side of Cape Blanco, which was known to the Indians. In fact, the Indians that lived up Sixes River, that was their sea otter hunting spot. Well, the animals this time found that same spot. Cape Blanco, Orford Reef, and Blanco Reef all had animals located on it. This is big country. I mean, this is a very large ocean, especially if you're a 60 or 70 pound animal floating in it. And it is amazing to me that without a guidebook, without anybody telling them where to go, they found these places in this large ocean. All the way south past Humbug Mountain and all the way to Cape Sebastian, Myers Creek, and Hunter's Cove south of the Rogue River. Hunter's Cove is so named, as well as the accompanying Hunter's Island you can see there, because that's where people went to hunt sea otters. This is also south of today what is the Otter Point State Park, just north of Gold Beach. Interestingly, to me at least, sea otters were not observed in areas where you'd think they might have gone. In fact, the Rogue Reef itself, they swam right by that, or seemed to. But Nellie's Cove itself, animals didn't seem to return to that site where the net pens had been. Other sites that scientists today think would be good habitat, they didn't seem to occupy. So let's look specifically at where they went and how many animals there were. And I'm going to do this in 3 phases. And you'll notice here that I've got, well, let's see, the color, is the color kind of standing out? No, it's not. So the 2 ellipses on the left are a man named Bruce Mate, happened to be a PhD student at the University of Oregon Institute of Marine Biology in Charleston. He was studying sea lions. And because there was nobody else out there to monitor the sea otter movement, Bruce kind of took it on himself to observe these animals and where they went and keep some records. So in the year as he was finishing up his PhD, he did some informal observations of the population from 1970, and then again right after the animals were released in 1971. And you can see the graph of how many animals he saw on those days. Then immediately after that, a man named Ron Jameson showed up at Oregon State working on his PhD, no, excuse me, his master's on the sea otter translocation. And for 2 years, he monitored very carefully their presence. And then, let's see, it's not going to let me go back. And then there's another phase of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service observations. So I'm not going to run through all of the observations, but to give you an idea of where these guys went, the little yellow dots represent an individual sea otter. So right after the release in 1970, and in October, about 3 months later, Bruce saw a total of 14 animals, which is about half of what was initially introduced at these sites between Cape Blanco, Orford Reef, Humbug Mountain, and 1 female who had taken up residence in Coos Bay near the Big Green Bridge, and who was enjoying eating Dungeness crabs and clams. He said she was very happy there. Whoop. That's taking me backwards. Let's see. Yeah, not really. Okay. I may have, there we go.
Is this what you want, or
The previous.
this?
Yeah, that's fine.
There? Okay.
Okay, so let's jump to June 27th, 1971. This is right after the animals were released near Cape Arago, and then the other batch were released down at Port Orford. So the next day or so, Bruce went out to Cape Arago, where the animals had been dumped into the ocean, and counted 5 animals, a total of 10, but 5 of them at Gregory Point and 5 of them down at Simpson Reef. This caused a great deal of sort of people showed up. They heard about it. They went out to see the animals, including people that were scuba diving and trying to get close to them underwater. So there was immediately a lot of sort of human interference, as they say. So at least 10 of the 22 animals, or let's see how many, 41 animals that had been released near Cape Arago were seen that day. One of the interesting things to me about all of this is that we know where they were seen, but we don't know where they were not seen. You know, if people weren't looking someplace, the animals could have been there. For instance, on this particular day, nothing shows up at Port Orford because nobody was there looking. So that's a big lesson for us going forward, is to be doing these observations a lot more thoroughly than were done here at this time. And likewise, though, on a little bit later, he actually did go back down to Cape Blanco, took a look, and found animals there as well as at up north around Cape Arago. This was on a day that and Bruce had a pilot's license, so he flew the coast all the way from Crescent City, California, up to Florence, using these high-powered binoculars to search for sea otters. Today, I would like to, just as a side note, up in Alaska, people are working on developing artificial intelligence scanning software to use aerial photos to look for signatures that are indicative of a sea otter in the water, or at least to pinpoint further analysis of those images. So because it's a big ocean and sea otters are very tiny, they're not easy to spot. So in December, then Bruce saw these animals again spread between Cape Arago and the Cape Blanco area. And then Ron Jameson arrived to begin his work on his master's. And immediately in February of 72, counted a total of 20 animals, 19 of them at 18 at Simpson Reef, including a pup, and then one down at Cape Blanco, or Blanco Reef, actually. But this was the first pup known to be born to this batch that had been translocated from Amchitka Island. And there's a photo of Ron and his wife out at Simpson Reef Overlook, which today has a nice little parking lot and a place where you can stand and look out over the reef. Later in that summer, he noted 2 major population centers, again around Cape Arago and again around Port Orford at Blanco Reef. Late September, they seemed to really aggregate down around Cape Blanco and only a few at Cape Arago. But by next March, in the early spring, they were back to 2 major population centers. Total of 17 animals. In April, up to 19 animals. And then by July 20th of 73, a total of 23 animals were seen, most of them down at Blanco Reef. In fact, this has become a little bit, and you'll see the pattern play out, where in the wintertime, they seem to have taken up residence in the shelter of Simpson Reef around Cape Arago, but in the summertime, moved down to Blanco Reef off Cape Blanco. Partly it's thought because of human interference around with easy access to the intertidal area at Cape Arago. But this seasonal movement seems to have been something of a pattern, which we'll see here. So this was, as it turns out, this was the high point of 23 animals, including some pups that resulted from the translocation of the 92 animals. And at this time, people thought, well, we're in pretty good shape. Again, then starting in the summer of 74, only summer counts were done by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Ron was done with his master's work and went on to other things, but then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and ODF&W took over and did a summer survey. And so in July of 74, they counted 21 animals, including 4 pups down at Blanco Reef. In July of 75, again, this time 13 animals at Blanco Reef. And again, this is just the summer count, and it does not really pick up on the seasonal movement to animals that might have occurred at to Cape Arago and other sites. 76, we're down to 12. 77, we're down to 4. 78, there were 4. 79 and 80, there were no surveys in the summer. By 1981, only 1 animal was seen. And in 82, no animals were seen, and none have been seen since. So I guess the questions are, there are many questions, but how many animals survived? In total, out of the 92, we had, from the initial batch of 29 animals, 14 seem to have survived enough to into the following year. So that's pretty good. That's 48%. And biologists today have told me that that's a good percentage. Typically, they could count on maybe 25 to 30%. So 48 is pretty good. 1971, the retention at Simpson Reef was 27%, but the retention at Port Orford is unknown simply because they weren't monitored. So during the first 2 years, the maximum observed on any day was 23 animals, and that represents an overall survival rate of 27%, which compared to other translocations is about average. So here are some of the factors that may have contributed, though, to the absolute decline and eventual winking out of that population. One is mortality. It's been suggested that unrecorded mortalities, i.e. gunshots, may have contributed to the loss. But the records show that there did not seem to be a lot of post-release mortality. In other words, nobody found sea otters washed up on the beach, and they tend to float and wash up on the beach. So only 12 sea otters out of that 92 are known to have died as a result of the releases. So mortality does not seem to be a major factor. The word emigration, and if you think about the emigrants on the Oregon Trail leaving Missouri and coming to Oregon, same thing. It's a phenomenon very common in translocation of species, where when you release a bunch of wild animals, a bunch of them want to go home. They're going to look around and say, this is not where I belong, and they'll leave. So yes, emigration undoubtedly played a factor here in animals leaving the area for parts unknown. I indicate here that even though animals were released at Port Orford, that one female immediately took up residence 40 miles to the north in Coos Bay. And over the next 2 years, animals were seen on the northern Oregon coast. And it's thought that maybe some of the animals released at Port Orford and moved north may have joined up with the population on the Olympic coast in Washington. We like to think they found a home. Reproduction. Did animals reproduce? And the answer is yes. There were a total of 15 animals, or excuse me, total of 17 pups that were reproduced during this period of time, which is slightly lower than average, but we don't really know the mix of males to females in the animals that survived the release. But pups were produced, which indicates that the animals found the habitat suitable and sufficient prey to support a female and her pup. The energetic requirements of feeding a pup along with themselves is quite high. So it looks like there was sufficient prey and habitat for them, which I talk about a little bit here, that the repeated use of these areas at Blanco Reef and Simpson Reef tells us that there's sufficient prey and habitat for them. So one of the things that has come up over the last 10, 12 years is whether or not they were genetically suited to be released in Oregon if they were captured thousands of miles to the north in the cold of the Aleutian island chain. And several studies seem to indicate, the first one showed that comparing the genetic signature of ancient sea otters to modern sea otters using the techniques in 2007, 2008, seemed to show that the Oregon sea otters bones were similar to the southern sea otter. However, more refined techniques used by Larson in 2012 and then Hannah Wellman in 2020 found that most of these sea otters either were a mix of no bigger than sea otter, the other were in fact, there's been subspecies of strong genetics does not seem to play in fact. In fact, biologists today will tell you that it really would make no difference. One of the tools we have available for us now, though, to help us understand this translocation and to predict future translocations are computer models. And I know that it's funny to think about sea otters and the wild habitat and all the vagaries of weather and ocean coming down to computer modeling. But indeed, there are some really smart people who have put together a really cool model of populations based on the availability of prey, the substrate type, the depth of the water, and you could put in a number of other parameters like the number of females to male mixture, the number of adolescents to and subadults to full-on adults, etc. And so, for instance, on the left there, in the model, if you introduce 92 animals, n equals 92, there will be this emigration phase where you'll lose a bunch of animals right off the bat, and the population will immediately drop on a downward curve. And the model predicts that the highest survival level is the upper side of that gray area, and the lowest survival rates are on the lower side, with the average in the middle. And you can see that the population would curve downward for about 10 years, and then eventually start to climb back up until 25 years later, you would end up on average with 39 animals. Although with the highest possibilities, it might be up to 150 animals, or it might even go to 0. And so we've taken the counts of this 1970 and 71 translocation, and those are the red dots you see there. And in this case, the population did indeed fit inside this probability curve that winked out after about 10 years. So it's not unheard of. And I like to think that if we did it again, we might even hit the high curve. So we'll see. So what did we learn? We learned that the animals did in fact adapt to the region. There seems to have been movement between Simpson Reef and Blanco Reef, which is about 45 miles. Other than the one animal in the Coos Bay estuary, they didn't seem to go into estuaries. None were observed or reported in either Coos Bay or the Coquille River estuary. And those are the two major estuaries in the region. A total of 17 pups were born, which is the good news. And pups were observed in both locations, on the north at Simpson Reef and on the south at Blanco Reef, indicating that the region itself is suitable for pupping. So we think that a sufficient number of animals were released. They're totally in line with the number of animals released elsewhere at the Olympic Coast in Washington, British Columbia, and Southeast Alaska. We are pretty sure that habitat and prey availability is sufficient. We know that animals found and aggregated at sites that have been predicted by modeling to be the best sites for sea otters. And again, I'm amazed because they did that without any outside guidance. They found these places. We can conclude that emigration was likely a factor, but not the sole factor. the subspecies issue of northern versus southern is not a factor. Unknown mortalities might have been a factor. And you know, in the words of a famous American, there are knowns and unknowns, and then there are unknown knowns or unknown unknowns. So we don't know. The other word that comes up is stochasticity. And think about baseball. This is really stochasticity is our random events that occur that affect overall conditions. And think about a baseball game. That is nothing if not a stochastic game, where a pitch here or there, somebody hits a foul ball. You've got a pitcher that's happens to have a blister on their finger. Somebody makes a mistake at first base, and suddenly the game totally turns around despite all these great players. So the same thing happens within a very small population. The random events of more male pups are born than female pups, or more female adults die during a storm than male. Suddenly the whole game changes. So stochasticity matters. And beyond that, in a very Zen sort of way, there are some things that can never be fully known. So we think the lessons for next time is that the Southern Oregon coast has sufficient sea otter habitat. We must account for emigration and tagging. Tagging was not done during this time, nor has it really been done anywhere, because it's hard to put a tag on a sea otter. You can't put them on there. You can't glue them to their fur. Their fur is so important that they obsess about their fur and keeping it clean. So you can't stick something on their fur. If you penetrate like an ear, that becomes a heat sink where their body heat leaks out. So U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and some other researchers with NASA have developed these satellite tags that they can clip onto their rear flippers, onto the leathery part of the rear flipper where there's very little blood flow and very little heat loss. But that technology was not available here. So tagging in the future, so you can account for various animals, is going to be crucial. Modeling also shows that follow-up translocations are crucial, that even if you add an extra 5 animals per year, especially if you add an additional 5 females per year over the next 6, 7, 8 years, the chances of survival go way up. So that's something that we're going to keep in mind. And probably one of the big lessons is that it's possible to select a general area, but you cannot predict exactly where these animals are going to go. They're going to want to go where they want to go. And even though you can say, well, this is good habitat over here, they may go somewhere completely different. So I guess the lesson is that the Cape Blanco airfield is still there waiting for the next time when we try it again. And I want to give a special thanks to a whole bunch of people, which I won't go through, but a lot of people have helped me put this together. I'm actually have run across a lot more personal information from people who were on the scene, and I'm hoping to put it together in a little publication. So this is our website. It's the world's best website devoted to sea otters. That was our goal when we started it. And by golly, you go look at it and you'll say, wow, this is the best website in the world on sea otters. So go to, you'll find out more about sea otters than you ever thought you wanted to know. You'll find out about us, our effort, and who we're involved with, and inform yourself. It's great. We got all kinds of YouTube videos too of hundreds of lectures that have been given and symposia that cover a lot of this stuff too, with some of the leading experts in the world. So with that, I'm going to go to questions, and Glenford, if you want to come take this away, you may, but I'm ready for questions, and I'll do my best to figure it out.
Here, and then we'll start moving around the room.
It seemed like some of the sea otters went to Cape Sebastian. Is that what it was called?
Yes.
But they were never seen there again, or is it just people weren't looking there?
The question is, if sea otters went to Cape Sebastian once, did they go there again, or were people not looking? And I think it's the latter. There are very few people live down on that stretch of the coast. And it was really, it's another 50 miles south of Cape Blanco to get down to Cape. In fact, it's further than that. So I think it was a question of manpower and observation, which is one of the lessons from all this, is that this is a big stretch of coast. And if you've driven it, I mean, it takes a while to get to where you can see these various sites. So we're talking organizing teams of people to be on the observation team at any given time. More questions? Another one. There you go. Good question. The question, if I heard it right, is over the last 50 years, why has there not been another translocation? If indeed we know how important sea otters are to keeping the urchin population under control and protecting the ecosystem. That's a good question. I think it's a lack of attention to the topic. And it wasn't until I first tumbled to this issue in about the year 2000, almost 25 years ago, when a man named Dave Hatch, who was a tribal council member for the Siletz tribe and a friend, came into my office one day and said, you know, I've been doing some research on sea otters. He had built a small boat and he was looking for a name for it. And in the Chinook jargon dictionary, he found the Chinook word for sea otter, which was Elakha. And he thought, if sea otters were important enough to have a word in the dictionary, why aren't they here now? So he was asking this question of biologists and other historians and others as to why sea otters were not here and why shouldn't we bring them back? The more he studied, the more he learned how important they were. And at the time, I was not ready to tune into what he was talking about. But about 12, 15 years later, I learned what he was talking about. And I think the question is that, or the issue is that the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife had basically so many things going on that nobody was really looking at, well, let's bring back sea otters. Because at that time, it wasn't really understood that the kelp beds off the Oregon coast were not in great shape. There was kelp, people were catching fish, all seemed right with the world. But underneath, the situation was degrading. So it really wasn't until Dave raised that issue of why aren't they here and what can we do to bring them back that really catalyzed the conversation. Dave unfortunately passed away about 7 years ago. And those of us on the Elakha Alliance board and some others kind of took his idea and tried to run with it to make it happen. And I will tell you that without putting too fine a point on it, nobody else is doing this. There are no other comparable sort of private nonprofits doing this kind of work around sea otters anywhere. And so we're feeling our way along, partly on the premise that you stated, which is these things are important to the marine environment. We need to be bringing them back. It isn't about cute and cuddly, although that's certainly a benefit that they're so cute and adorable. It's really about the ecosystem and the health of our planet. So that's why we're really focusing on this spectacular animal and trying and making an effort to bring it back. Yep.
The building of, as far as humanity is concerned, as we gradually built up a circumstance where we can be more efficient with regards to what we're doing, thus the destruction of the planet. But it seems to me that the same thing goes for the otters. And has there been any observations with regards to them expanding from their local areas and migrating from there, expanding their
Good question. And I think what you're asking is, can they, as a species, can they repopulate areas where they had formerly been? Why do, in some respects, why do we need human intervention to sort of play God with this? The answer is that, yeah, probably over the next 6,000 or 7,000 years, they would probably fill in the blank between the 800 miles between the Olympic coast and south of San Francisco Bay. But there's a couple of key reasons why it's very difficult to do that, and especially do it on a time scale that will make a difference with what we're seeing in our ocean. The first is that females only have one pup a year. They don't have a litter. And when they're born, after they're born, the mother has to teach it everything. And for the first 8 or 9 months, she's the one that has to feed it. So she's having to find food for herself to satisfy her requirements, plus nursing this pup and eventually teaching it all that it has to know. So females stay put. They do not move around except to find additional food. So that's part of it. As a species, they don't have seasonal migrations of any distance, although we did see a little bit of that between Cape Arago and Cape Blanco, but they don't really migrate per se. But the other limiting factor, at least for the Oregon coast and the Northern California coast, is the shape of the coast. It's essentially a straight line. Whereas in Southeast Alaska, where the population has exploded, it's a planar space, a two-dimensional space where a sea otter can move in any direction to find sufficient habitat. Whereas on the Oregon coast, for instance, between Cape Arago and the next really suitable sea otter habitat is a distance of about 120 miles north of Newport. So in the meantime, there's areas that are not really suitable for sea otters that are needing to feed a pup and so on. And the same is true on down into California. The linear coastline and the availability of food and how sea otters successively occupy parts of the coast is a real limiting factor to their spread too. Over time, yeah, they might repopulate this 800 miles where they're now vacant, but we need them here sooner than that. So it is a little bit of a human intervention in the ecosystem to make up for what was done by humans intervening in the ecosystem 100 years ago. And for me personally, there's also a big component of the tribal connection that's very important here. Coastal tribes, in the stories that are told and have been passed down through generation, considered the sea otter to be almost a family member, relative of the human people, the sea otter people, the human people. And that cultural connection was lost at the same time the tribes really lost all that they had in terms of their homelands and way of life. And so part of that is, frankly, for me personally, part of the mission too, is to restore that connection. And along that line, I would just point out that last fall, the Oregon Historical Quarterly published 3 really interesting and very informative articles about the cultural connections of sea otters and the history of sea otters on the Oregon coast. So I commend that to you.
Right. Question from the online audience. Otters were recently seen near Cannon Beach. Where did they come from and what do we know about them?
Question. Sea otters were recently seen near Cannon Beach, Ecola Point. And where did they come from and what do we know about them? They were likely adolescent males that detached from the Washington population up off the Olympic coast. And we think we know that because of all the animals that drift down, the individuals we see along the Oregon coast, they are always adolescent males. And if any of us in the room have ever been an adolescent male, raise your hand. We're out exploring and looking for a good time, right? So that's what they're doing. And that's typically how species spread. That's one way that they spread, is that young males who have not yet attached to a home range go out looking for other opportunities. So we're pretty sure that that's where they came from and why they were here. Now, where they went, we really don't know. They were here for about 3 weeks plus, and then poof, they went away. So it was a gift while they were here. It was really fun to see the video of these two otters in the water together. I just thought, oh man, this is a glimpse of the future. Yes, we have another question. Good question. What is the population status of sea otters? Alaska, as you know, is an enormous piece of territory. And if you'd asked that question 20 years ago, I would have said that the population out along the Aleutian Islands is booming. Well, it did boom for a while. And then a lot of things caught up with, and I'll talk about that in a second, but that population is in decline. And in fact, it's been relisted as on the threatened and endangered list. But Southeast Alaska, Prince William Sound and down into Southeast Alaska is sea otter heaven. And from over the last 50 years, 60 years of translocations into that area, there are now about 30,000 sea otters in Southeast Alaska. In fact, we've joked that there's so many sea otters that we could probably go up there and have communities offer to give us some, drive them home in a van if we wanted. So in Southeast Alaska, they're doing very well. The population in California, well, to move down the coast, they're starting to expand around Vancouver Island. And it's surprising to me that they haven't taken off more there, but it's estimated there's like 1,500 animals around the northern tip of Vancouver Island and onto the British Columbia mainland. Don't tell anybody, but they've also been seen, a few animals have been seen across the straits on Haida Gwaii, where they once lived. Along the Washington coast, there's an estimated 3,000 animals along the Olympic Peninsula, but they don't seem to go into Puget Sound, the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and they have not, other than these individual animals, don't seem to be moving south of about Grays Harbor. In California, the population there is about 3,000, also about 3,000 animals. It's spread from a core little remnant population at Big Sur that survived into the 3,000 animals today. And there's some concern about this animal. It's the quote southern sea otter subspecies, and it has not been able to expand its range to the north or the south, primarily through shark predation. Not that sharks eat them for food, but young sharks that are learning what to eat, and there's a lot of white sharks, as it turns out, will test bite anything that looks like it might be food, including, say, a surfboard or a sea otter. They seem to never eat the sea otter. They just chomp it and go, ooh, that's not right, and spit it out. But that experience is universally fatal to a sea otter. And that seems to happen frequently enough because of the lack of kelp beds to provide protection, camouflage and protection for sea otters to the north. So that population is 3,000 animals and fairly steady. There is concern about it being able to expand. And I want to thank those folks that are leaving, not to call attention to them, but adios, buddy. All right. Special shout out to family. Another online question.
Is it better to attempt a relocation of northern sea otters again, or would southern sea otters be more appropriate?
Good question. Back to the northern and southern question. Everything that we know about the ability of sea otters to adapt to an environment says that it probably would make no difference. But because of the availability of sea otters and the huge abundance of them in Southeast Alaska, and the fact that they are not listed as a threatened or endangered species in Southeast Alaska, means that just lowers the regulatory hoops that we have to go through. Now, there's a great deal of interest in reconnecting the gene flow between the northern sea otters, he said, waving his hands for those on the Zoom call. Reconnecting the gene flow between the northern and the southern sea otters. And one way to do that would be to bring both animals to the Oregon coast. And so it's likely, in my mind, the common sense is that we could get the starter population from Southeast Alaska and then supplement it over time by surrogate reared animals from the, say, Monterey Bay Aquarium program and introduce the southern genetics into the mix. And there's a question back here. And so that's probably what we'll do.
Just wondered if changing ocean temperatures has any impact on this sort of translocation, or maybe why they didn't do so well this time in Oregon.
Question about whether or not ocean temperatures played a difference or made a difference. And we know it is a warming ocean. Now, whether it was those weather anomalies and water anomalies were present in the early 70s, I haven't gone back to look. That's a good question. It's likely to not make a huge amount of difference. The water temperatures along, at least in the near shore, that are dominated by the California current, which sweeps around, the North Pacific current hits the North America right about the Washington coast. Some of it peels off and goes south all the way down to Mexico as the California current. And that's a pretty uniform batch of water in which sea otters would be. So it's, even though we get these heat blobs that really can affect, tuna migration or salmon or phytoplankton, zooplankton, it's really unknown as to the degree it would affect sea otters. And we don't think it's going to be a huge thing, but we're paying attention to that.
While you were counting history, kind of taken aback by all the different agencies that were involved to make that initial possible. Have you all done any type of financial estimates about what it would take dollar-wise to do a similar taking over spot?
It's a scary number. Just to back up on that slightly. About 4 years ago, we commissioned a scientific feasibility study of this whole effort. A year or so later, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, using some of our published material, did their own feasibility assessment. And at that time, U.S. Fish, who would be the agency ultimately responsible, just spitballed a cost of anywhere from around $20 million over time. Clearly, I mean, you can figure out what's the cost of all the logistics of capture and transport and release and monitoring. It's going to add up. There's no question about it. And just to highlight this for you, we are soon going to be trying to turn some of our attention to working with our congressional delegation and others in Congress, including the California delegation, to begin to find U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service the financial resources to take this on. It's clearly an effort that's beyond just a small nonprofit like the Elakha Alliance. We're happy to help raise money, and there's undoubtedly donors out there that might want to drop $1 million into this, but it's going to take far more than that. So the numbers can get a little staggering if you really pencil it out. But that's a good question. One, I'm happy we're at that stage of the game where we're thinking about that. And along that line, I would just say the Elakha Alliance incorporated in 2018. Formalized the actions they've had for effort. So that over 6 years ago. And if you look at the California condor experience and what it took to bring them back, that was a good 20 years or more of work among various partners and people holding hands, and donating with funders and so on. And you look at other efforts, the grizzly bear and the wolf, and so these things take time. But I'm optimistic, and I have to be at my age, that we're going to get this done in the next 5 or 6 years, at least an initial translocation back to Oregon. It may take longer than that. Elections, as they say, elections have consequences. So we'll see what happens in November. I'm pretty confident that no matter what happens, we're going to keep working on this. It's just a question of how fast can we make progress. But I'm hopeful that within the next 5 or 6 years, we can really have a plan in place to bring animals back to Oregon. Okay. Good. Ooh, I like that question. The question is, how are sea otters related to river otters? And the second question is, what am I hoping to get out of tonight with in terms of motivating all of you here? Well, first, let me go to the river sea otter thing. They're not even the same genus. They're within a similar order. There's like 9 different families of otters around the world. There's giant river otters in South America. There's the sea otters here. There's the river otters. There's a bunch of them, but they're not even really, they're distant cousins, I guess you might say. And we do get a lot of reports of people saying, oh, we saw sea otters. They were all over the dock at Astoria. And no, those are river otters. So river otters do go down into the marine environment. They will go down and forage in the intertidal area, but they always come out of the water to eat, to poop, to sleep, everything else. So whereas sea otters stay in the water all the time. In fact, they can't not be in the water except for brief periods because they have to keep their fur clean. The second part of your question, what do I hope to get out of you tonight? Thank you. This is all about building public awareness and hopefully instilling some sense of understanding of this animal and this issue. And through understanding and appreciating it, we hope to gain your support. And one of the ways that you can support is Chanel's got some cards back here at the merch table that you can fill out and send to your congressman and senator saying, we want this to happen. We need to start letting them hear from us that this is something the public really wants. It's one thing for me to go to Senator Merkley's staff and say, yeah, we've been doing all these outreach things, all these public meetings. Yeah, it's really going great. It's another thing to hear from you. And it makes a difference because at the end of every week, they go through a list of who have we heard from and what are the issues people are interested in. So I encourage you to stop by back here and pick up a postcard or go online and send your own comment to your congressman, congresswoman, senator, even if it's not within, even the California delegation, let them know you're interested in this. The other thing is, of course, donations. We have a small staff. We have 3 full-time employees and a couple of part-time contractors. We're trying to stay lean and mean and burn the midnight oil to get this thing done. But contributions help, especially contributions from the public, because quite often the larger grants that we get are devoted to specific projects, and public support, financial support helps us to be flexible in how we allocate our time and what we do. So thank you for the question, but that outreach to, and to your state legislators too. We've been trying to keep the Coastal Caucus members involved and in understanding what we're doing. We've gotten no pushback. We've been working with the crabbers on the South Coast and elsewhere. There are some concerns, but we're trying to meet those concerns. And so it's all about building support and letting the elected officials around us know that you care about this topic.
There was a question online that follows up right with your.
Okay, follow. Okay.
Otters eating urchins help the health of kelp beds, which in turn improves fish habitat. how do we educate fishermen and crabbers about this? That otters help make the fisheries healthier, so they don't see them as competition and shoot them.
Good question. And that is a major question. And that is, how do we educate fishermen and crabbers to understand the positive role that sea otters play in the marine environment and as a positive effects on their livelihood so that they don't shoot them? Well, we're working on that. One of the things that we've done is about a year and a half ago, we hired a young man who lives now in Coos Bay with a lot of local experience working with landowners and watershed restoration. But we've tasked him with being our community outreach person to literally meet with fishermen and the crabbers one-on-one on their boat, on their dock, in the processing plant, to talk to them about our mission and why this is important. I think it's fair to say that most fishermen and crabbers that we've talked to understand that the ecosystem's in trouble and that there's perhaps a tension between their continued use of that ecosystem for harvesting fish and shellfish and the need to restore it to some level of health, particularly, and they understand the loss of kelp beds and what it means. So we've been out, Kyle's been working with local fishermen, meeting with them. We've got a whole project planned to use catch data along with the modeling that we've got going to prepare some scenarios of what some potential impacts might be, and then go back out and meet with these guys. But a lot of it is the one-on-one outreach, which takes time. And that's going to be another, year and a half, 2 years, 3 years. I don't know. It's going to take time, but we are definitely working one-on-one with the fishing industry, keeping the Dungeness Crab Commission informed, working with the folks at ODF&W who work on marine fisheries and shellfish. So just trying to build support, build understanding, and enable people to help us make some choices about what to do and where to do it. One more?
Give me two. This one, I think one.
Wondering how Oregon State is doing with their research.
Oregon State research, or Oregon State University research on their otters, on otters. It's interesting. When we first started the Elakha Alliance, I had a conversation with a woman at Oregon State who runs the Marine Resource Management Program, a graduate level program. And I'd worked with those folks for years when I was working for the state. And I said, this whole sea otter problem is so gnarly. It's so interesting with so many different facets. It'd make a great topic for a graduate student, for a master's student. And she said, you're right. So we had, long story short is, they found, and a graduate student, Dominique Koné, spent 2 years working on this issue to try to assemble from a scientific basis what might be known and unknown about the potential impacts of sea otters on the Oregon coast. And that stimulated a lot of other work, particularly through the Marine Mammal Lab in Newport. I had a conversation about 2 weeks ago with a woman named Lisa Balance, who's the director of the Marine Mammal Lab, which parenthetically, the aforementioned Bruce Mate started when he was a professor at Oregon State. Bruce, who did his PhD on counting these sea otters back in the day. At any rate, I had a conversation with Lisa about the role of the Marine Mammal Institute in helping us with research. And further, she's going to be the new chair of the U.S. Marine Mammal Commission. And so at sort of the political level, it will be fun to work with her there too. There's other people at Oregon State in the Department of Integrated Biology who are working on a lot of long-term studies of the dynamics of the nearshore ecosystem through the PISCO program, Partnership for Interdisciplinary Studies of the Coastal Ocean. which Jane Lubchenco helped start years ago. They are part of our family of professors too, that we routinely connect with. But beyond that, there's also a whole bunch of other scientists from California, Monterey, at University of California, Monterey Bay. Chanel would help me with this, but a number of people in California, because sea otters are present in California. And there's a lot of work being done on them and their impacts on estuaries and other parts of the ecosystem, including kelp beds. So, as well as folks at Simon Fraser University and University of Alaska. So we've got a network of researchers in the academic institutions along the West Coast. And that's been really fun to sort of poke my nose into what a lot of smart people are working on. And I get to reap the benefits of their hard work. Dead battery. Yes, that's a good question. Were other translocations during that same time period, how did they do? There were translocations from Amchitka per se in 68, 69, 70, and 71 to Prince William Sound, to several locations in Southeast Alaska. In fact, there were several efforts into Southeast Alaska. The Olympic coast of Washington, 69 animals were translocated to the Olympic coast. And then British Columbia, Vancouver Island, there were like 60 or 70, and then Oregon. And all of those have done well. Oregon, and that's part of the mystery of Oregon. Why did the Oregon one not work? What happened? Because the others did succeed and provided the founding populations for the 3,000 animals, for instance, that are there today on the Olympic coast, or the 1,500 that are on Vancouver Island. So yeah, the others did well. And so the mystery remains what happened in Oregon. And again, as I said, some things can never be fully known, but I think we've tried to analyze the situation and figure out what may or may not have gone wrong and what may or may have gone right as well. Because just because it didn't succeed the first time, Tim Tinker, who is the world's expert on this population modeling, said, you try the same 92 animals next time, it might take off like a rocket. So it's part of it's just the chance of putting these animals into a very dynamic environment with a lot of changing conditions, literally on a moment-to-moment basis. So we'll see. But beyond that, I just want to say, I want to thank you one more time for coming out and spending the evening here. I really enjoy doing this and sort of being a missionary for this effort to everyone. And I appreciate your interest and the time you spend here this evening.
Very much. Good talk.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I spent some time in the Monterey area.
Oh, yeah.
At Monterey
You
Bay
saw
Aquarium
them.
a lot. You can see. tons
Yeah,
of
yeah,
them.
they're right there. It's like, oh my God.
I've often wondered why aren't they on the Orford
Yeah.
coast?
Yeah, it's a very sad story.
Yeah.